December 24, 1944. Christmas Eve. The English Channel was cold, grey, and deceptively calm. Thousands of American soldiers crowded the decks and holds of the Belgian transport ship SS Léopoldville as it moved steadily toward the French port of Cherbourg. Most of the men aboard belonged to the 66th Infantry Division, a unit recently arrived in England and now being rushed across the Channel to reinforce Allied lines in France during the final phase of the war. For many of them, this short sea crossing felt routine, almost anticlimactic. The worst fighting, they believed, was already behind them. Some had survived the Ardennes fighting. Others were fresh replacements who had not yet faced combat. Christmas was only hours away, and thoughts of home crept in despite the cold wind and heavy seas. Below deck, the ship was packed far beyond comfort. Soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder in dark holds that smelled of oil, sweat, and damp wool. There were few lifeboat drills, no detailed safety briefings. The crossing was expected to be brief. The Channel, though dangerous, was considered largely secure. But it wasn't. Unbeknownst to the men aboard Léopoldville, a German submarine, U-486, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Gerhard Meyer-Werdemann, was stalking Allied shipping lanes beneath the winter waves. Though Germany's submarine fleet had been badly weakened by late 1944, isolated U-boats still prowled the Channel, waiting for opportunities. That opportunity came just after nightfall. At approximately 5:54 p.m., without warning, a torpedo slammed into the starboard side of Léopoldville. The explosion tore through the ship's hull near the engine room, sending a violent shockwave through the vessel. Lights flickered, then died. Steam and smoke filled the lower decks as men were thrown from bunks and passageways collapsed in seconds. Confusion spread instantly. Officers struggled to assess the damage. Orders were shouted but often contradicted. Some soldiers believed the ship would remain afloat. Others realized immediately how serious the strike was. The ship began to list sharply to starboard, water rushing in faster than it could be contained. And yet, no clear evacuation order came. As minutes passed, the freezing Atlantic poured into the wounded vessel. Men trapped below deck fought their way upward through smoke-filled corridors, climbing ladders slick with oil and seawater. Others waited, uncertain whether abandoning ship would be more dangerous than staying aboard. Outside, darkness closed in. What followed would become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American military history, a tragedy that unfolded in confusion, silence, and bitter cold, while Christmas Eve passed unnoticed on the sea. If you enjoy listening to documentaries and war history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Also turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on any new post. As the damage spread through Léopoldville, the reality aboard the ship became impossible to ignore. The torpedo had struck deep and low, flooding the engine room and cutting power almost instantly. Without electricity, the ship was plunged into darkness. Emergency lighting failed. Men relied on shouted warnings and instinct to find their way through the chaos. The list to starboard increased steadily. Loose equipment slid across decks. Water climbed stairwells. Below, soldiers trapped in lower compartments beat against sealed doors, their shouts quickly swallowed by steam and rising seawater. Above deck, officers attempted to regain control, but the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone expected. Crucially, no general abandon ship order was given. Some officers feared that ordering evacuation too early would cause panic. Others believed the ship could still be saved. As a result, hundreds of men remained aboard far longer than they should have, waiting for instructions that never clearly came. When lifeboats were finally lowered, disaster followed. Several were damaged by the ship's sharp angle or smashed against the hull. Others could not be launched at all. Life rafts were scarce, and many were never deployed. Soldiers, weighed down by heavy winter uniforms and gear, hesitated at the rail, staring down into the black, freezing water below. The temperature of the Channel that night hovered just above freezing. Immersion meant death within minutes. As the ship's tilt worsened, panic began to spread. Some men jumped. Others were pushed as the decks grew slick and unstable. Those who entered the water found themselves fighting not only the cold, but oil, debris, and powerful currents pulling them away from the sinking ship. Inside Léopoldville, the situation became hopeless. Water reached ammunition stores and crew spaces. The engines were dead. Radio communications were sporadic and unclear. Nearby Allied vessels had received fragmented distress messages, but the scale of the disaster was still not fully understood. Just over an hour after the torpedo strike, Léopoldville gave its final shudder. The ship rolled sharply to starboard, exposing her keel. Men clung to railings and ropes as the deck disappeared beneath them. Then, with a deep metallic groan, the the transport slid beneath the surface of the English Channel. Hundreds were still aboard. In the water, survivors screamed for help, their voices carried briefly by the wind before being lost to the night. Oil burned the eyes. Debris struck heads and limbs. Men who had survived combat now fought a different enemy, cold so intense it robbed them of breath, strength, and consciousness. And rescue had only just begun, late, uncoordinated, and tragically insufficient. In the freezing darkness of the English Channel, survival became a matter of minutes. Men thrashed in the water, fighting instinctively against shock as icy waves seized their bodies. Heavy boots dragged them under. Wool uniforms soaked through almost instantly, becoming dead weight. Some soldiers managed to cling to floating debris, wooden crates, planks, pieces of the shattered ship, while others struggled to stay afloat with nothing but raw determination. The cold was relentless. Within moments of immersion, muscles began to seize. Hands lost strength. Legs stopped responding. Men who had leapt from the ship full of resolve found themselves unable to swim more than a few strokes. Shouts for help quickly turned to gasps, then silence, as hypothermia took hold. Rescue ships were nearby, but help did not arrive as it should have. Several Allied vessels in the area initially misunderstood the situation. Some believed Léopoldville had been damaged but was still afloat. Others hesitated to approach closely, fearing additional submarine attacks. Coordination between rescue ships was slow, confused, and hampered by poor communication. When rescue efforts finally began in earnest, they were chaotic. Life rings were thrown into the water, but many drifted out of reach. Nets were lowered over the sides of ships, yet men were often too weak or numb to climb them. Survivors who had lost the use of their hands slipped back into the sea again and again. Some had to be hauled up by their collars. Others were never reached in time. Adding to the tragedy, many rescue vessels lacked sufficient lighting. Sailors struggled to spot survivors in the oil-darkened water. Flares illuminated the sea only briefly, revealing scattered figures before plunging everything back into darkness. Those pulled aboard rescue ships were often barely alive. Their skin was blue, their breathing shallow. Some died moments after reaching the deck, their bodies unable to recover from prolonged exposure. Medical personnel worked frantically, but the numbers were overwhelming. Hours passed. By the time the last survivors were recovered, the sea had gone quiet. The cries had faded. The wreckage drifted aimlessly. The channel reclaimed what it had taken. In total, 763 American soldiers lost their lives that Christmas Eve night, most of them not to the explosion itself, but to the cold, confusion, and delay that followed. It was one of the deadliest losses of American life at sea during the entire war. Yet almost no one back home would hear about it. In the days following the sinking of SS Léopoldville, the scale of the disaster became impossible to hide, at least within military channels. Casualty lists were assembled quietly. Survivors were questioned, debriefed, and then ordered to return to duty or reassigned to other units. There were no public ceremonies. No press releases. No acknowledgement of what had happened in the Channel on Christmas Eve. The official reason was security. Allied commanders feared that revealing the sinking would alert German forces to the continued effectiveness of U-boats in the Channel. Morale was another concern. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging. The Allies needed momentum, not headlines about hundreds of soldiers lost at sea just hours before Christmas. As a result, the disaster was classified. Families in the United States received brief, carefully worded telegrams informing them that their sons were missing or lost at sea. No explanation followed. No details were offered. For many parents, wives, and siblings, the truth would remain unknown for decades. Survivors carried the burden silently. Men who had watched friends vanish beneath the waves were discouraged from speaking about the event. Some were explicitly warned that discussing the sinking could result in disciplinary action. Others simply found that no one wanted to listen. In a war filled with massive battles and staggering casualties, this tragedy had no place in the official narrative. Even within the military, accountability was limited. Investigations were conducted, but responsibility was quietly dispersed. Questions about delayed evacuation orders, insufficient lifeboats, and poor coordination during rescue efforts were never fully addressed in public forums. And so the story faded. 4 years, Léopoldville remained little more than a footnote in classified reports, its name absent from history books, its victims unrecognized beyond private family grief. Veterans who survived the sinking gathered quietly on anniversaries, sharing memories among themselves, aware that the nation they served had largely forgotten what they had endured. It was not until decades later, as documents were declassified and survivors began to speak openly, that the full scope of the tragedy emerged. By then, many of the men who had lived through that night were gone. For decades, the sinking of SS Léopoldville remained largely unknown outside of a small circle of survivors and grieving families. Unlike famous naval disasters, there were no immediate investigations made public, no official acknowledgments, and no place in the broader story of the war. The men who died that night were absorbed into statistics, names on lists without context. Slowly, that began to change. As wartime records were declassified and veterans spoke more openly in later years, historians uncovered the truth behind what had happened in the English Channel on Christmas Eve, 1944. Survivor testimonies revealed the confusion, the delays, and the fatal miscalculations that turned a single torpedo strike into a catastrophe of historic scale. Memorial efforts followed. Plaques were erected in Cherbourg, where the men were meant to land. Memorials honoring the 763 American soldiers lost aboard Léopoldville were dedicated in the United States and Europe. For families who had waited decades for answers, recognition came late, but it came at last. The wreck of Léopoldville still lies on the seabed of the English Channel, a silent grave marked only by coordinates. It serves as a reminder that not all wartime losses occur on famous beaches or in decisive battles. Some happen in darkness, confusion, and cold, far from cameras and headlines. The tragedy of Léopoldville was not the result of enemy action alone. It was compounded by human error, poor communication, and the false comfort of routine. It exposed the cost of assuming safety in a war that offered none. On Christmas Eve, 1944, while the world prepared for celebration, 763 American soldiers never reached the front lines. They never fired a shot. They never saw the enemy. Yet their sacrifice was no less real. Remembering Léopoldville is not about assigning blame. It is about restoring voices that were lost to silence. They were not missing. They were there. And they were lost. If you enjoy listening to documentaries and war history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Also turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on any new post.